Hello and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. My name is Sarah and I love sewing, crafting and fashion. I really like to make my own clothes and recreate outfits using both store-bought patterns as well as patterns made by small businesses. I would love to be able to learn how to make patterns to create my own styles, but for now I want to focus on making garments from patterns. Anyway, we'll get into the main part of this video, which is this top. I'm using this Vogue pattern and I'm making option A. It has a tie up front and wide sleeves. The fabric I use is this really beautiful crepe fabric. It's quite flowy and it's quite lightweight as well. This fabric is actually some spare fabric that I had from a previous project where I made this dress. The fabric is stretchy and quite flowy, so it'll be perfect for the wide flowy sleeves. Now, going into the sewing, there's only about 13 steps in the entire pattern, so it doesn't take too long to actually make. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into making the top. For step 1, pin the front pieces in place with right sides together. Backstitch at the start and stitch at a 1.5 seam allowance along the edge. Once you're at the last stitch, make sure to backstitch there as well. Then cut all your loose threads. You don't need to tie any knots after backstitching, as the backstitching already secures the stitching. Trim the corner fabric at the tie end and trim along the curve near the center of the bodice. Turn the front bodice pieces right side out, then press with an iron. If you're using crepe similar to mine, in which it's made out of partially polyester, set the iron on a low heat. Once you're done pressing the edges to neaten, baste the raw edges together by using a long stitch on your sewing machine. My stitch setting was about a 4 or a 5. This stitch is really important as it will help hold these bodice pieces together when you eventually sew the front sleeve pieces to them. For step 3, pin and stitch the darts in the back. To make sure your darts look more professional, sew past your point in a straight line as close as you can to the edge. This sort of helps smoothen out the corner or the dart that you would see normally if you would leave it like that, but this just kind of gradually eases it into the garment. Then you want to iron the darts towards the center back. Pin the back to the front at the shoulders, having the back neck edges extending 1.5 centimeters. Stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance and then stitch again at a 6 centimeter inseam allowance. Then trim close to the second stitching and iron the seam allowances towards the back. Stay stitch the back neck edge. I believe this is to help stabilize the fabric, as you'd be sewing on the cross grain, which is slightly stretchier than if you were sewing on the straight grain. For step 6, make a bias tape. I made a 30 centimeter by 4.5 centimeter bias tape. I then threaded the fabric through a bias tape maker, and as I was threading it through, I was pressing it with the iron to help hold its shape. I found this step quite fiddly, however, pin the bias tape to the back neck edge, place a crease on the seam line, and having ends extended 6 centimeters beyond the shoulder seams, then stitch along the crease and trim the seam allowance even with the bias tape. Turn the bias tape to inside along the seam, turning over the ends even with the shoulder seams. Iron flat and then baste the outer edge of bias tape in place and stretch the tape to fit. On the outside, stitch close to the basted edge. Pin the back to the front at the side edges, matching the notches at the sides, and have the back lower edge extend about 1.5 centimeters below the front pieces. Stitch a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance down the edge, then stitch again 6 centimeters away from the side. Trim closely to the second stitching and then iron the seam allowances towards the back. Stitch the seams of the sleeves using a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. I'm actually going straight to step 12. For now, I'm skipping step 11 because I want to group up all the hand sewing steps together, which is step 11 and step 13. For attaching the sleeves, I actually sewed gathering stitches from between the small circle markings. I sewed a 4 to 5 centimeters stitch length at 6 centimeters and a 2 centimeter seam allowance stitch. And then I used these 2 stitches to gather the shoulder to help fit the sleeves to the bodice. When pinning, I matched the notches and circles of the sleeves to the matching notches and circles of the bodice and adjusted the sleeves using the gather stitches as needed. Well, I didn't do that either because I'm lazy and I really struggled sewing the sleeve to the bodice because of this. But like it was very difficult sewing any accidental pleats. It is achievable, yes, but I do not recommend it, and instead I recommend basting before you sew to make the process a lot easier. For hemming the back and sleeve, I used a different technique than what was said to do in the pattern, as I still wanted to maintain the drape of the fabric and I didn't want a double folded hem to affect this drape. I did use an E-stitch. It is a good idea to use it. I personally didn't need it for the back and one of the sleeves. I probably would have benefited using a stay stitch on one of the sleeves because it was fiddly to hand stitch. I folded the hem once and by 1.5 centimeters. I then hand sewed, I believe it's called a blind hem. I basically made a knot at the end of my thread, then sewed in the hem from between the layers, then pulled the stay stitch through and threaded a tiny bit of the back and then moved the needle between the back and hem layers and threaded it through the hem again. The reason I only sewed a tiny stitch in the back is because you want as little thread as possible to be visible on the right side of the back. I then ironed all the hand sewing seams that we've just done, the sleeves and the back, gave the garment a bit of an iron over, and then now it's all completely done. I hope you enjoyed watching this video and thank you so much for watching.